the great fundamental issue now before our people can be stated briefly. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not.
I believe in the American Constitution. I favor the American system of individual enterprise. I am in favor of protection. I believe in the permanent court and further limitation of armament. I am opposed to aggressive war.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Whether we shape the future in the image of our hopes is ours as to determine by our actions and our choices. If we succeed, generations to come will say of us now living that we mastered our moment.
Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
Bringing Heartland America into the heart of the swamp. This is The Right Take.
How's it going, everybody? This is episode number 53, a President's Day edition of The Right Take. I'm Eric Lendrum, here with my co-host Jacob Gernstaff, and yes, we are recording on this wonderful Monday, President's Day 2022. We were talking about this before. This is one of those holidays, I swear, it just sneaks up on you out of nowhere. You know, I was not even aware that this particular year, I did not even know this holiday was coming up until like 2 weeks prior, when suddenly I looked at the calendar and was like, oh, I have work off that day. It's just such a great feeling, an unexpected, a very welcome surprise to have a Monday off for any reason, but especially a great patriotic American holiday like President's Day. You know, don't you just love President's Day?
I do love President's Day, but apparently there's some people who don't love President's Day.
What else is new in America in 2022, am I right?
John Harris in Politico writes, "It's time to cancel President's Day." So what's interesting about this, or this is in Politico magazine, the fracturing of society in recent years under the strain of Donald Trump's presidency and the racial reckoning spurred by George Floyd's murder has had one positive consequence: a widespread awakening of interest in the American past. So apparently Americans didn't have any awakening interest in its past before George Floyd's death and before Donald Trump's presidency.
Yeah, it's not like we ever taught history in schools or anything.
We didn't teach history in schools. Americans weren't the least bit interested in schools. All we cared about was consumerism. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, because our benevolent elites and overlords realized that, you know, Americans really need to learn about their past. They need to learn about how horrible their racist ancestors were. So they did use the presidency of Donald Trump to awaken Americans of just how horrible Americans are and how Donald Trump is the personification of America's evil, racist, fascist past.
And how modern day circumstances like, you know, George Floyd, a career criminal literally dying of a fentanyl overdose in police custody, is somehow like the new Emmett Till, basically.
So in light of the widespread awakening of interest in America's past, curiosity about the country's history has been a pathway to something more bracing. Sharp arguments about the meaning of the past and about the lessons people living today should draw from the lives of people who died long ago.
Translation.
This is what they talk about all the time. They'll argue that they'll use words like arguments, discussions, conversations, listening. They'll use words that give you the impression that they support everyone sitting around in a circle and having an open conversation where everyone is free to present their worldview.
Everyone
and their
gets
view on history.
Gets to have their input, basically.
And this is exactly what you see on Twitter. They'll show trending Candace Owens, and then underneath it they'll give a blurb. Readers discuss whatever so-called controversial thing that Candace Owens just did, or they'll put in Donald Trump. Readers discuss the recent tweet by Donald Trump, and they give you the impression that the reason why this person is trending is because people of different opinions are having a genuine conversation. They're having a genuine Twittersphere discussion about this person. Everyone's sitting around a great big old round table like it's the United Nations or something. But in reality, these topics that are trending wouldn't be trending if Twitter didn't push it to the very top. Exactly. And nobody would be talking about this if they didn't make it a conversation. Of course, the people who are at the very top of the trending pool are those who are pushing the opinion that the Twitter masters want us to believe and want us to take. And this is true whenever you have professors who will have a roundtable discussion with the public. So, as an example, Georgia Southern University had a discussion after Charlottesville of 2017, after the riot in Charlottesville, about Confederate statues. They had 3 professors. They were going to have a discussion, a Q&A with the public. The public comes in, and all 3 of these professors agree. There's no disagreement among any of them. They all agree that all Confederate statues need to come down because they represent a shameful past in Southern history. And there's no debate. There's no discussion. They're all on the same page. It's a great big academic circle jerk at that point. And because, again, these are educated people, edumacated, they have all their fancy diplomas. Oh, clearly, if you're smart, if you're educated, if you've gone through this rigorous education that we have, you will understand that this is the right opinion. That's the correct opinion to have on this matter because we say so. When in reality, the reason why they're all professors is because they had the right opinions to begin with. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been allowed past the gatekeepers. But exactly. I digress. So anyway, go ahead. That was one more thing, too, I had to note about that paragraph where it says, the lessons people living today should draw from the lives of people who died long ago. Translation, all I see when I read that is that's their justification for saying, the people of today should suffer for the sins of the past. That's what it's really saying there. Of course. And of course, when they make it the outlook like we're supposed to have a discussion about the lives of people who lived in the past, what they really mean is we're going to have you sit down and we'll start the discussion. We'll tell you what we're going to talk about, and then we'll tell you what to think about it. And we'll correct you if you have a negative opinion, if you have the wrong opinion. And if you continue to double down on that wrong opinion, you'll be removed. Or unacceptable opinions, as Justin Trudeau prefers to call it. And we'll come back to that later. Long forgotten lives, like the dozens of people killed in the Tulsa race massacre, are being vaulted into public consciousness. No, they're not. Exactly. Nobody's thinking about any of those lives lost in the Tulsa massacre. No one knew about this until literally 2020. It was, again, the idea they made Juneteenth somehow like an anniversary of the Tulsa race massacre when that's literally not what Juneteenth was about at all. It's just, blows my mind. But we talked about this on a previous episode. More controversially, people who long enjoyed revered status in the national story are being dethroned as national heroes. Dethroned by mobs of radical Bolsheviks. Decapitating statues. They make it sound like it's a good thing, though. They make it sound like, these people never should have been your heroes, and here's why. Everything you knew about the founders is wrong. Historical reappraisal has been especially vigorous in a particular arena, the U.S. presidency. Woodrow Wilson, talk about Woodrow Wilson. They talk about the presidents on Mount Rushmore. They talk about, of course, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, slave owners, and Abraham Lincoln, of course, and they give his quote on slavery during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. And, of course, they use this to show that Lincoln was a horrible person, horrible American racist. We cannot honor him. He points out 2 ways of looking at history. One is by mythologizing heroes of the past in a kind of civic religion, and the other is examining heroes of the past or alleged heroes of the past, pointing out their flaws, and using that as a way to start a discussion on how to reform the present. In other words, using the past as a means to bring about revolution in the present. So he's not actually advocating for completely abolishing President's Day, as he mentions here. He says this hints at a more profound problem. A democracy really shouldn't be mythologizing presidents at all. From the left, it seems obvious that we don't need a holiday honoring 46 presidents, all of them men. From the right, if that matters. From the right, it seems obvious that we don't need to be honoring the aggrandizement of Washington-based politicians. And nobody on the right, literally nobody on the right thinks that about President's Day. Nobody cares to assume that we shouldn't honor any presidents in our history because they're all from Washington. The swamp of today is not what it was in Washington's day. All right, it was a literal swamp back then, but it was not a hive of festering
corruption and just bureaucracy run amok. It was actually a government that served the people. It was a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as they intended it. So to equate, Washington and Adams and Monroe and Jefferson with, these bureaucrats who run our country now that is insulting. That is just absolutely insulting. And yeah, like you said, no one on the right is saying that.
And another thing, if you point out, one thing we've pointed out many times is when people on the left use the word democracy,
they always say our democracy.
They're not talking about people electing people to go to Washington and serve their interests. That's not what that's the official definition of democracy. When they're obviously talking about something very different. He writes, yes, by all means, let's keep a day off to reflect on lessons of the American past. So he's not wanting to do away with the holiday like the title of the article would lead you to believe. He says, but let's make this about real history, an invitation to humility and renewed commitment to national purpose rather than mythological history, an invitation to arrogance and complacency. A better name would be Citizens Day. It seems likely Lincoln himself would agree. I don't know where he's getting that from.
Shoot me. Oh, yeah, the Founding Fathers and others like Lincoln would agree with us erasing them. Yeah. Citizens Day? What is this actual neo-Bolshevik garbage?
It is straight up. It's not neo. It's just straight up Bolshevik garbage.
This would create, if we did assume this as our national mindset, this would be a never-ending cycle because they're always going to say that America is always doing something wrong. Even, woke America right now in 2022, they're going to look back on 20, 30 years from now and say, oh, they were not on board with transgender rights back in 2022. They were still oppressing, specifically black transgender women were being oppressed. They're always going to retroactively create more oppression and more, mistreatment of minorities, quote unquote, and all this stuff.
Well, they're not necessarily against that. They're not necessarily against that idea. And this is one thing that a lot of conservatives make the mistake of thinking that liberals today are being short-sighted because future liberals will see them as reactionaries. Current modern-day liberals of this stripe, they're perfectly okay with that. They don't mind if future liberals see them as horribly backwards and racist because in their minds that would represent progress, that every generation should create a new definition. I've actually had someone tell me this. She was a teacher. Interestingly enough, she teaches elementary students, and she told me that it's good for every generation to develop a new definition of racism so you can continue to progress and move forward. And she sees that as a wonderful thing. So they're not necessarily opposed to the kind of the perpetual cycle of what is the word? Whenever
boogeyman bigots.
No. Whenever you back in the Middle Ages, whenever they were crashing,
heresy?
Iconoclasm.
Iconoclasm.
They're perfectly okay with a perpetual cycle of iconoclasm because in their minds that is society progressing to new and better heights. They don't see any value in the past except to learn what not to do.
Yeah, of course I know the left is going to go along with it just fine, even if current generations and future generations. But I'm saying it will be bad for the country as a whole. Obviously, it will be bad for decent people to be constantly told, "Wait, we legalized gay marriage 20 years ago. Why are you still telling us that we're homophobes?" Like, average people are going to be caught in the crossfire, and it's not going to be pretty. You're not going to have a country left. It's going to be this messy, ugly, modern art hodgepodge of just ugly colors and ugly textures, just making just a mess of nothing, man. I don't even like to think about what America's going to look like in 30 years from now, or even 10 years from now. I can't imagine what it's going to look like, and it's not going to be pretty.
But his argument that a democracy shouldn't be mythologizing presidents at all brings me to an article I came across in the Christian Science Monitor. Something, whatever happened to the Christian Science Monitor?
I was going to say, that's the Star Wars line. That's the name I've not heard in a long, long time.
I don't think I've read a single article from CS Monitor in probably 10 years. This used to be the staple during the Tea Party era. Like Christian Science Monitor, this was the go-to if you wanted a neutral platform that was going to give both sides fairly and not play one side against the other.
Reminds me a little bit of IJR, too. Remember IJR? I think it was Independent Journal Review or something. That's another publication it was a really big deal back in like the early, mid-2010s, and then it just disappeared like out of nowhere.
So this is going way back when CS Monitor was was the king of the hill back in 2012. So from 10 years ago, President's Day 10 years ago, why you should stop calling today President's Day. True, many refer to today's national day off as President's Day, but federal law actually lists the holiday as Washington's birthday. We don't care what that mattress sale ad says. There is no such thing as a National President's Day. It's a myth, like the story about George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and throwing it across the Potomac at Abe Lincoln. Yes, there's a federal holiday off on February 20th, 2012, but its official name is Washington's birthday. We're supposed to celebrate the life and legacy of the father of our country, not the rest of those Mount Rushmore guys. They can get their own holiday. Okay, we know we're swimming upstream here, but because every sale in the U.S. this morning will talk about special President's Day prices, Other media routinely refer to this as President's Day. It is President's Day in the popular mind. It just isn't President's Day in U.S. law. So technically in U.S. law, it was never made President's Day. It became known colloquially as President's Day to honor both Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and all the presidents combined, because it's more of a catchy ring if you're going to have a President's Day sale as opposed to a George Washington birthday sale.
Right.
So from a corporate standpoint, it's kind of like how Thanksgiving morphed into Black Friday. You're kind of, or the prequel to Black Friday. Corporate America completely botched and destroyed what was good and decent about American holidays, and they turned a nationalist holiday into a corporate holiday. And what's interesting is this kind of shows the trajectory of American history. You have holidays and monuments to great men of the past in America's past that mythologizes America's nationalist history, kind of the way European countries will mythologize their nationalist heroes. And then you have corporate America that steps in and just swallows up and destroys everything that is good and decent and nationalist about this country. And they turn everything into the pursuit of corporate profit. And what's the next stage after that? The complete deracinization of everything in American history. You corporatize everything, and then then you have the woke left that comes along and says, oh, look, everything is too corporate. People aren't paying attention to their history. They don't know what they're celebrating. Let's inform young Americans of what they're actually celebrating. Let's inform them of just how horrible these presidents were, how horrible George Washington was, how horrible Abraham Lincoln was. And it's very easy to get a new generation of Americans to buy into that if their conceptualization of President's Day is just a blowout sale. If their conceptualization of Thanksgiving...
If it's all consumerism.
Yeah, if it's all consumerism. If their conceptualization of Thanksgiving isn't the Pilgrims in American history, if it's just
Black
going to
Friday.
Walmart
Yep.
and getting trampled by a bunch of people trying to grab a scooter off the aisle, then it's very easy to say, okay, look, this is what we're really celebrating. It's okay to keep the holiday, but let's change the name. We don't want to honor these white racist men of the past who founded this country. Let's just call it Citizens Day.
So going back to foreign policy, again, which is something we normally don't do here on The Right Take, but this is something that is worth acknowledging, because going back, of course, to the Russia-Ukraine stuff that we have talked about in previous episodes, and this, of course, does tie back into, coincidentally, one of my favorite political figures in all of American history, someone who is featured in our new intro, a soundbite from him, and that is, of course, President Richard M. Nixon. And this is an op-ed from the New York Times. I know, but it's okay, just... Don't worry. It's not as bad as you would expect most New York Times articles to be. By Farah Stockman. And the title reads, quote, "This is the Russia-China friendship that Nixon feared." So obviously a bit of historical context that I can provide just right off the bat, just knowing what I know of Nixon, is that Nixon's biggest foreign policy move, but other than negotiating the peaceful end of the Vietnam War, was ultimately opening relations with China, opening Red China, as it were, to relations with the United States. And he did this specifically because he wanted to drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union, because these were the two biggest communist countries in the whole world at the time. And he feared that if they were to align themselves against the United States and against the West, it would actually, of course, it would be a much larger and even more existential threat than the Soviet Union already was. So that was his reasoning at the time. Yes, in the time and the context in which he lived, it made sense. Obviously, we look back now and see this economic alliance we have with China as literally one of the worst decisions in American history, I think, because it led to China's complete economic superiority over us and the rest of the globe, the complete hollowing out of our own economy and our infrastructure as a result of outsourcing jobs to China, their slave labor, making cheaper goods that outsells our stuff. So in hindsight, yes, if you judge Nixon based on what eventually came of his decision to open China, yeah, you would see it as a bad thing. But at the time, I understand where the man was coming from, especially being the hardcore anti-communist crusader that he was. The article starts off, quote, "Mao Zedong arrived in Moscow in 1949 expecting to be feted for delivering China, the world's most populous country, to communism. Instead, Joseph Stalin humiliated him by making him wait for a meeting. Didn't know that. Although Stalin and Mao eventually signed a treaty of friendship, Mao chafed at being treated like a hayseed from a backward country. By the 1960s, Mao was openly feuding with the Soviets over leadership of the communist world. The Soviet Union and China even battled each other in 1969 over disputed territory along their long border. That created an opening for President Richard Nixon's trip to China on February 21st, 1972. A diplomatic overture aimed at peeling China away from the Soviet orbit." Hey, that's 50 years ago today. That is 50 years ago to this day that happened. Interesting. Purely coincidental, we swear. In the short term, Nixon's 8-day visit was an unambiguous success. Chinese leaders agreed to help spy on the Soviet Union. Nixon won re-election. The stage was set for China's eventual integration into the global economy. But as we mark the 50th anniversary of that visit, some U.S. officials and foreign policy analysts have second-guessed the wisdom of partnering with Beijing. As I said earlier, Even Nixon apparently looked back on the strategy with mixed feelings and possibly some regret. Russia was a military threat, but never an economic rival. China, however, is becoming the first power in a century capable of challenging American dominance on both economic and military terms.
So, of course, throughout the article, she's lamenting the fact that we're in this position, that you have China and Russia who are unnatural partners. And this is what she quotes a few experts who point out that, a few foreign policy experts who point that these two countries don't necessarily have to be friends. Like, there's not anything that unites them. They certainly don't share the global Marxist outlook, or Russia's not a Marxist economy any longer.
Calling them both communist is like, it's kind of like lumping in a bunch of different Muslim factions together. Like, they may share that broader brand of Muslim, like Shiite or Sunni, but they're definitely not the same. They would not consider themselves partners.
Yeah, and so she actually refers to them as the axis of autocracy. And of course, the New York Times considered Donald Trump to be an autocrat, so they lumped Trump into the same boat with Putin and Xi.
Of course.
So, the idea that she actually advocates for waging what is, she doesn't explicitly say it, but an economic and a strategic Cold War against these countries, viewing them obviously as enemies, which shows you how they view the right in the United States. For them, the lessons of the Cold War is not the victory of capitalism or communism. It's the victory of democracy over autocracy. We look back on the defeat of the Soviet Union as the victory of the free market. They look
capitalism over communism.
Right. Yeah, they look back on it as the victory of the free and open society, a la George Soros. So this is one thing we got to understand. When we look at China, the right's view of China as a rising power, obviously we both the right and the left in America don't like China. Both the right and the left in America don't like Russia that much. The right, obviously, it has a much different take on Russia. Our take is that Russia should be left alone to carve out a little sphere of influence in Eastern Europe that doesn't affect us in any way, shape, or form. Her solution to this is really interesting, though. She says the truth is that she talks about how that China and Russia are pointing out that the world has changed since the Cold War. She writes, the truth is that the world has changed. American democracy doesn't look as shiny as it used to. Many people in around the world, another typo in the New York Times. You wouldn't expect the New York Times.
Oh my God, I see it.
But she says many people around the world are tired of Westerners telling them what to do. That's true. She says, and yet the world is not jumping at the chance to be bossed around by the world's largest surveillance states either. It's not an exaggeration to say that the fate of the world depends on our ability to get the response to this axis of autocracy right. The fate of the world depends on liberal Democrats' ability to get it right.
That world police thing again. And I also just have to acknowledge, she said, the world's not jumping at the chance to be bossed around by surveillance states either. You mean kind of she's referring to China and Russia there, obviously, but really, lady, you really want to not acknowledge the fact that the U.S., like it or not, has the largest surveillance state in the world?
Well, see, here also we outsource our surveillance to major corporations. That's the difference. We let the corporations do the dirty work there. They just go ahead and say, why would we just cut out the middleman? Let's just do it ourselves. But she writes, Americans have to stand up for our values and our allies without ending up in a catastrophic war. No matter how testy relations become, we should remember that the biggest threats we face today, climate change, the pandemic, and nuclear proliferation, threaten Russia and China too. So here's the solution. Here's the solution. Let's avoid war by going to Russia and China and trying to convince them that climate change, the pandemic, and nuclear proliferation are the biggest threats to world security and peace and prosperity, and they need to get on board with our agenda of fighting those three threats. Three threats that the American right isn't the least bit concerned about. No one on the American right is concerned about climate change. No one on the American right is concerned about the pandemic. And nobody on the American right is concerned the least bit about nuclear proliferation. Nuclear proliferation is going to happen. The pandemic is going to spread.
Exactly.
And climate change is going to happen. And nothing we do is going to stop any of that.
Yeah, global warming isn't real. The pandemic is over-exaggerated. And again, keep in mind, if you really want to go to China to talk to China about the coronavirus, lady, again, where did the coronavirus come from?
Exactly.
Friendly reminder. And yeah, nuclear proliferation, it's going to happen anyway. Countries are going to have nukes. You're never going to get every country to give up their nuke. That's just not going to happen.
But the hubris that this woman displays is what you're seeing among the neoliberal left today. The hubris and the arrogance that you're seeing from this woman is the same thing that you're seeing among the entire American neoliberals, because they're seeing their power and what was supposed to happen crumble before their eyes. They're standing there in the middle of a bunch of ashes, their hands on their heads, looking around and saying it was not supposed to be this way. And rather than change course, they don't have a solution other than just to dig in deeper. Like, well, let's try to get it right. You're losing ground. But rather than change course of action, they're like, no, we're completely right. We were always right from the beginning. We just need to fight harder. We just need to dig in deeper. And there's no self-reflection. There's no self-examination.
No
of what's
introspection.
Going on. No, absolutely no introspection whatsoever. But yeah, so that's their view of the world. Everything's collapsing, but let's just keep doing what we're doing. And speaking of which, even the Atlantic is starting to realize that they're losing ground and they need to do something quick. Because they need to change the narrative.
When you told me this, when you first said, oh yeah, one of the things I want to talk about today is an op-ed from The Atlantic, I said, oh boy, what'd they say this time? And then you said this.
So this is from today. This is by Emily Oster. It's an op-ed. She writes, kids' last COVID policy makes no sense. She writes, local governments are relaxing pandemic restrictions at a dizzying pace, removing mask requirements and vaccine entry rules for businesses. Politicians are generally pushing for a return to normalcy, but for one group, change is not forthcoming. Children. And she talks about how Democratic governors all around the country are removing mask mandates. The outdoor mask mandates are going in some places. The indoor mask mandates are going in some of the bluest of blue areas. But one area where Democratic governors and mayors are not removing mask mandates is in schools. So adults are able to go everywhere maskless, but the children are still having to mask up. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the points she brings out are stuff that people on the right have been saying for a year and a half.
Yep.
So for instance, she writes, first, one could argue that ongoing child-specific restrictions are warranted because children need more protection. And she cites the CDC to show that this simply is not true. Children do not need more protection than adults. She writes a second possible argument in favor of a kids' last policy is that COVID mitigations work better in child settings than others. The data don't support this argument either. Evidence from test-to-stay programs, for example, suggests that more than 97% of kids who are exposed to the coronavirus at school and are then required to stay home never end up testing positive. Keeping these kids out of school then isn't meaningfully halting community spread. As for masking, others have made the point that after 2 years, we still have paltry proof that face coverings significantly lower case counts at school.
Again, even Anthony Fauci said this back in March of 2020, that masks don't do jack to stop the spread of this virus.
Even if you are skeptical of these arguments, masking in school as practiced is certainly not more effective than masking in other settings. The largest masking randomized trial in Bangladesh found the highest efficacy among older individuals. A final argument, she makes three arguments here. She says basically arguments against taking the masks off children. She writes, the final argument is that because vaccination rates among children are low, and this is probably the most poignant argument that liberals have been making for the past year. She writes that because vaccination rates among children are low and children under 5 are still not eligible for vaccines, they may have higher case rates, and lowering case rates in this group is important to protect the vulnerable, especially the unvaccinated. Over the past several weeks, however, case rates have been fairly similar across all age groups. Moreover, and I think that this is perhaps the more important point, this argument is geographically mismatched. Areas with a high proportion of unvaccinated individuals tend to have limited restrictions on children. Areas with high vaccination rates tend to have strict rules. 3-year-old kids in the Northeast wearing a KN95 mask outdoors at recess, yes, there are places where this is still required, do not protect unvaccinated adults in the South. So this is something that you see everywhere. I had the misfortune of going to Montgomery County yesterday, and everyone is wearing masks outdoors. I saw someone biking alone with no one within 500 yards, and she's wearing a KN95 mask.
And you see a lot of that in D.C. in general, too. It's just all over the place. People walking up and down the sidewalks and everything. Nobody else around, but they're wearing masks. It's ridiculous.
So on the way here this morning, I saw someone actually pulling out of the parking lot. They had a KN95 mask on. They're the only one in the vehicle. Like, this was something that you would see in April 2020. No one would have guessed in April 2020 that liberals would be so hard-pressed to own the cons that they would still be masking up in their car by themselves in February 2022. But it's just maddening. Like, they have, and the thing is, like, even liberals have updated their hardware. Even in the Atlantic, they're running articles saying this is madness, you need to stop, take the mask off the kids. And they're still going around wearing masks outdoors. And what's interesting, it mostly is political. This shows it is all politically motivated.
It has nothing to do with the science changing or cases going down. Nothing to do with that. It's because the poll numbers are going down. It's because of what happened in Virginia. It's because of all these school board elections all across the country where conservative anti-CRT, anti-lockdown candidates are sweeping into majorities and are rolling all this back already. And they want to put a stop to that.
And they see that they're about to get a shellacking at the polls, and at this point they're trying to, ring the warning bells early. Hey, we need to get out in front of this now, because the reality is liberal areas would continue to mask kids forever if they felt that was what the CDC wanted them to do. If they felt that Dr. Fauci felt that it was safe for kids to wear masks forever, regardless of the COVID numbers, they would want their schools to keep the mask on the kids indefinitely into the 2030s and the 2040s. And they understand that that independents and even a lot of Democrats don't want this, and they're trying to tell the liberal establishment, hey, you need to get out in front of this now because this is going to be a problem in November.
You're going to have a whole bunch of Youngkin victories all over the country if you don't do something about this now.
She concludes, based on the science, the kids' last approach makes no sense. Kids should face fewer restrictions than their parents, not more. But after 2 years of telling parents to be afraid for their children, policymakers can't simply turn around and tell them that kids are low risk and everything's fine. Yeah, they can. They can just say, look, it was all politically motivated. Take the mask off your kid. We were just kidding.
Yeah, but if they do that, of course, if they admit it was politically motivated, then they'll still get shellacked in November, because then they'll be like, how dare you use my kids as political pawns?
Policymakers need to carefully and patiently explain why and when the mask will come off and the quarantine rules will end, while making clear that parents can still choose additional precautions no matter what local governments mandate. One way or another, and sooner rather than later, we need to let children return to normalcy. So they've basically gone full circle to what the right was arguing a year ago, or even a year and a half ago. And I've noticed this in the past week. You've had article after article trying to find a way to tiptoe away from the draconian mask policies. One article basically said you need to discuss with local people what they want and tailor your mask policies to what your local citizens want. I'm thinking, wait a minute now. If you tailor your mask policies to what your local citizens want, does that somehow stop the coronavirus more than if you just make everyone mask up?
They're trying to find a way to get out of this without admitting that they were wrong.
Yes.
That's the thing, because this would, obviously they would have to, that would imply, the mask mandates were never a good idea to begin with. It was all just about power. It was about undermining President Trump and getting rid of him using the election law changes and whatnot with COVID as an excuse. And then after he left, even after, the big bad orange man left, maintaining power because they are so hungry for power. And that's the thing with Fauci, especially. In an interview just the other day, he was asked, I think it was MSNBC, they were asking him, what is the date? When can we say that the pandemic is over and masks can come off? And he was like, well, I don't think there's any single number. There's really not going to be a specific date or a number. We just have to be prepared for it to, to keep going. And you can tell he just wants to cling desperately onto this power that he's been given for as long as possible, because he is the most powerful man in the country, arguably, in terms of the public perception, the PR relations, and he does not want to let it go.
All right, so moving on from our criticism, because we do like to criticize on both sides when both sides warrant criticism. We are the right take, so we do very firmly and unapologetically side with the political right in America. But there are times when the so-called political right in America just can't quite seem to get the narrative straight.
And there are several right-wing, quote-unquote, conservative publications in particular that absolutely warrant our criticism. And one of them, when you told me that this article came from this particular outlet, I was just said, all right, let's go. I dislike the Washington Examiner a lot. I really, really don't like them. The land of Brad Palumbo and Tiana Lowe, and really cringe anti-Trump, Ben Sass fanboy takes. But the Washington Free Beacon, I can't stand them. I can't stand, if nothing else, never ever forget, the Washington Free Beacon is the publication that started the Russian collusion nonsense. Mm-hmm. They were the first ones to hire Christopher Steele to start compiling a dossier on then candidate Donald Trump, because Washington Free Beacon was for Ted Cruz. And of course, Cruz was seen as, a top contender for the nomination other than Trump. So they initially got that ball rolling, and that ball eventually ended up in the Hillary Clinton camp, and we all know where it went from there. But yeah, so for that reason alone, among other things, but let's turn now to criticizing them for something they did much more recently. Jacob, what did our friends at WFB have to say about AOC?
So I came across this headline, and at first thought I was like, okay, here we go again. Like we've been through this. This is so the continual obsession of the right with AOC is particularly concerning, because the right is more obsessed with her than the left is.
Arguably, yeah.
And furthermore, the continual branding her as a socialist. We did an entire episode on AOC.
The roots of AOC's rage.
The roots of AOC's rage, and you can go back and listen to it. It's highly recommended. We actually thoroughly, in my opinion, debunk the notion that AOC is a socialist. In fact, we thoroughly debunk the idea that she's even a democratic socialist. She is not any of that. She's basically a social democrat. She is like a European-style
social democrat
leftist
with tastes of a green party in Europe, with obviously very, very green party influences. And not only to debunk these, more typical socialist brandings, but also we debunk the idea that she's stupid. This idea that she's a 14 IQ, like really dumb broad who got elected to Congress. Like, yeah, she's no genius, obviously, but to act like she is just a bumbling moron who has no idea what she's doing or saying is not accurate, to say the least.
So Fox News and the right did everything they possibly could to present a facade of AOC that made her look like just a bumbling moron who didn't have her constituents' best interests at heart, who didn't care anything about the people she claims to represent, is just really ditzy. The same way that the left has always tried to brand women on the right. So you think of how they treated Sarah Palin. You think of how they treated Michelle Bachmann. You think of how they treated all these,
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
They tried their best to make these women look like just really, really ditzy, dumb women who have no business being in politics, who just need to stay in the kitchen, that type of thing. They won't come out and say that, but that's actually
what they believe.
That's what they act like. Like, these women just need to stay in the kitchen and keep having babies to their right-wing husbands and not get into the public square. So this is the persona that they've sold AOC to the right, especially the older generation of right-wingers, that she's just a dumb, idiot millennial kid who doesn't know anything. So this is a review. This article in Washington Free Beacon is a review of a book that has recently come out, or is actually set to come out here shortly, called Take Up Space, The Unprecedented AOC. And of course, it's just a big puff piece on AOC by a lefty for lefties.
The cover is like a painting, an inspirational looking, like kind of like the Hope Obama style poster, painting of her looking off into the distance.
That look is South American Marxist propaganda. If you go to all the leftists in South America and Central America, that is the look, like the Venezuelan style leftist. That's the look that you'll see.
And I got to acknowledge one other thing too about this before we dive into the article itself. The header image that they use for this article. So it's an inset of that book cover of the painting of her looking inspirational, and it's inset to a freeze frame of her at, I'm assuming, some kind of campaign rally. I think it's a Bernie rally. Yeah, there's a bunch of people behind her, but and she is looking off somewhere towards the camera, clearly in the middle of shouting or chanting or something excitedly. Her eyes are wide, her mouth is like a big just round O. It's a weird freeze frame that makes her look really goofy and awkward. But that's one more thing we gotta talk about. I hate when the right does this, is that I've never seen this image before, but what's the one image, Jacob, that people try to use of AOC to make her look like dumb whenever they're criticizing her? It's that image of her laughing with her eyes kind of squinted shut and her mouth open and her two front teeth are really prominent. And people would always put that picture next to a horse and say, "Oh, she has a horse face. She's butt ugly. She looks terrible." Yeah.
So this tactic is taken straight out from the neoconservatives, because the editor in chief of the Washington Free Beacon, I believe, is the founder, Matthew Continetti. He is the son-in-law of Bill Kristol.
Oh, of course.
So he married Bill Kristol's daughter. Bill Kristol, of course, the neocon in chief in this country. The Weekly Standard.
Well, it was Weekly Standard, and he left that when that went under. He went to the Bulwark.
So the Weekly Standard, the artwork that came out of the Weekly Standard, they always dehumanized their enemies. That was a feature of the Weekly Standard. No other right-wing publication dehumanized its enemies, its political opponents, the way that the Weekly Standard did. They
Those would weird cartoon caricatures.
They would always draw exaggerated cartoon caricatures of their political opponents, to the point that even people on the right, you look at that, it's like, why are you doing that? All you're doing is garnering sympathy from people who would be opposed to these people. You don't have to delegitimize their humanity in order to refute their ideas. But the reason is because the neocons are Trotskyites. At their core, they are Marxists. Their roots are firmly in Marxism, and Marxists never humanize their opponents. They always dehumanize their opponents, delegitimize their opponents. You destroyed your enemies. You didn't counter them in any way, shape, or form. So when the neocons moved over into the right, we had moved over from Trotskyite lefties to neoconservative people on the right in America, they of course took their really basically Alinskyite tactics over with them. Of course, they were basically Bolshevik. They weren't Alinskyite. Alinsky was he was like a fellow traveler, but they brought those tactics of dehumanization with them to the right. And of course, this is what you get.
When they use it so much to try to deny reality and say, "Oh, she's ugly. I don't understand. People will think she's good looking." I'm like, okay, congratulations. You found a really bad looking picture, a rare bad picture of her compared to all the other pictures of her, the photo shoots she has done, other things. She is objectively a good looking woman, and not just by political standards. I would argue just in general, she is attractive. And again, I think that is key to her success. If she was, if she was fat, if she was ugly, she would not have the platform and the prominence that she has now. But that is one more thing they just fail to understand or just refuse to acknowledge about AOC's effectiveness.
And also, it doesn't refute the ideas, because Bernie Sanders is not actually something you want to look at. Like, even if for women, like Bernie Sanders is not, he's not like he's a Justin Trudeau.
No.
So.
Same with Ron Paul, for that matter.
Right, exactly. So it's the ideas that carry that. I mean, having good looks and being young and attractive and everything, that's helpful. But that alone,
especially in the social media age. But yeah,
that alone does not carry the day. The ideas are the ones that carry the day, and you're not necessarily refuting the ideas by delving into the looks. But anyway, I digress. Let's go ahead and dive into their review of this book.
By one Andrew Stiles is his name.
He writes, remember AOC, the public figure sometimes referred to as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the millennial influencer and two-term Congresswoman star power, has faded considerably since Donald Trump left office, but you might recognize her from 2021 headlines such as AOC wears tax the rich dressed to Met Gala and spotted AOC's Tesla parked illegally outside Whole Foods in posh D.C. neighborhood. Most of us could see the reminder. Like most left-wing institutions, CNN, for example, Ocasio-Cortez has struggled to stay relevant in a world without Trump. A Democrat is president now, albeit not yada, yada, yada. Take-up space is due out February 22nd and may have already succeeded in getting AOC's name back to the headlines earlier this week. Well, no, actually, you're succeeding in getting her name put back into the headlines. Earlier this week, The New Yorker published an extensive interview with the Congresswoman in which she lamented the reality of her situation. Congress is a blank show that never stops being scandalizing, she said. Our current political system does not revolve around the majority. For example, she thinks Biden should use executive power to cancel student debt, a legally dubious act that would primarily benefit a small fraction of wealthy individuals. Okay, so here we go again. So the Washington Free Beacon, this guy thinks that by canceling student debt, that would only help a small fraction of wealthy individuals. Why don't you tell the hundreds of thousands of people in West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, whose parents never went to college and literally make $10 an hour and live in complete dumps, live in houses that are falling apart, who have racked up tens of thousands of dollars in student debt because they were sold the idea that college was the gateway to the middle class. That if they studied hard in school and they went to college and they made good grades in high school and college, that they would be able to pull their dirt poor families out of poverty. Why don't you go explain to them that canceling their student debt would help only a very small fraction of wealthy elites? And the argument he's making is the exact same argument that Joe Biden makes when he argues against canceling student debt. Because Biden points out that his kids, one kid racked up $130,000, another $150,000, $160,000, and he's like, they paid it all off. And so his argument is you can pay off your student debts, but most people who have student debt, which is about 35 million Americans, they don't have a dad who's a lifelong senator
exactly.
that can get them lucrative deals, or vice president that can get them lucrative deals with oil companies abroad to pay off their hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. So this is another fatal flaw of the right, because you have tens of millions of young millennial, or not so young anymore, they're in their 30s now, of millennials who would like to achieve the American dream. They would like to get married and have kids, buy a home, but they can't. And they don't like Democrats, and they turn to Republicans, and Republicans basically tell them to bootstrap. So like, okay, forget you. Like, I'll go vote for Democrats if that's your attitude toward us. He writes, the book may be considered a success on several fronts. First and foremost, it succeeds in demonstrating that some people shouldn't be allowed to write about politicians. Professional journalists, for example. When they write about Democrats, it comes across like the MyPillow guy writing about Donald Trump. So another dig at the MyPillow guy and Donald Trump, of course, being the Washington Free Beacon. Her alt assessment of the Congresswoman's place in history is infused with the same messianic hysteria that adorned the media's coverage of Obama's rise to the White House. Other celebrated achievements include the online makeup tutorial AOC did for Vogue magazine, in which she explained how putting on makeup was both a radical and liberating act of self-expression as well as an oppressive instrument of the patriarchy. That's pretty funny. By far the most insightful contribution to the book is Andrew Rice's essay on AOC's most significant political accomplishment and perhaps the most meaningful thing she has ever done to affect the lives of her constituents. Beating Bezos departs from the book's hagiographic vibe by presenting a rather unflattering account of AOC's opposition to Amazon's effort to open a second headquarters near her district in Queens. The response from local residents was one of outrage. In fact, the Amazon headquarters, which would bring thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in community investment, was incredibly popular. Now,
we've talked about this.
Before, and we actually talked about. We had someone on the show to talk about Amazon coming to Crystal City, Virginia, which was where they split it up. They were going to do one in Virginia, one in New York, but. The benefits of Amazon coming anywhere are going to be mixed. The area that AOC represents isn't exactly high income or upper middle class. And by Amazon, this isn't an Amazon warehouse. And I think this is where a lot of people on the right didn't really understand what was happening. This is not a warehouse that's going to provide blue-collar jobs to working-class people.
No.
This is a center for Amazon. Like this is going to be the second headquarters.
It's called a headquarters for a reason.
And it was going to bring in roughly 50,000 high-tech workers with degrees. These high-tech workers with the degrees were going to make six figures. People who make six figures don't want to live in the kind of neighborhood that AOC represents. So what would end up happening is this would be a boon to developers. Developers would come in, they would evict all the residents, they would tear down all the apartments, they would build up nice, fancy, high-rise condos that these new six-figure salaried employees at Amazon would make. The people who are displaced, they would not be able to live in that neighborhood because nowhere in that neighborhood they would be allowed to afford rent. They would have to move far, far away from the neighborhood they grew up in. And also another thing, that it's not just the housing, it's also the businesses. In Crystal City, there's a street called Restaurant Row. It's multiple restaurants and bars that have been there for decades. That entire area is going to be completely destroyed when Amazon comes through. And it's angering a lot of residents who love those restaurants. They grew up going to those restaurants. They hang out at those restaurants on the weekends and watch games. They're not going to be able to do that after next year because all those restaurants are going to be torn down and displaced once these new high-tech workers move in. So the benefits are very, very mixed. It's not really helpful to the local residents who don't have master's degrees.
And there again is the issue we talked about before, where the right can only think in fiscal terms. They can only think in numbers of like GDP or wage growth or whatever. They see, oh, it's going to create jobs. It's going to create jobs. Clearly, it's good. It doesn't matter if it's jobs. Even if it was one of those Amazon warehouses, Jacob. Even the Amazon warehouses here in the United States are notorious for horrendous working conditions for their workers. You really think that's the kind of job that a lot of these people would have wanted? Even if it's a job that pays well, but, treats you like a slave and you can't even go to bathroom breaks, as allegedly happens at warehouses here in the United States. That wouldn't be good for them. None of this would be good for them. I actually do support what AOC did to keep Amazon out of her district. Again, sometimes simply creating jobs is not always a good thing. If, simply creating jobs is a good thing, then, outsourcing jobs to China is a good thing because, again, it, increases our GDP and it decreases, the prices at the end of it. Decreases prices, so things are cheaper. It's just, this whole article, like you said, it's just garbage. Again, to be expected from the Washington Free Beacon. But like you said, this obsession with AOC, to me at least, proves that people on the right who are obsessed with her are somewhat jealous of the level of influence and fame she has achieved. That she is kind of Trumpian in a way. She is very much, she's very good on social media. She rolls with the punches. None of the criticism ever really seems to get to her. She's able to label her enemies really well. I think I would argue she did learn a thing or two from Trump, but obviously she just kind of turned it around into a left-wing model instead of a right-wing model. But ultimately, I think this obsession with her for the time being is misplaced because there are bigger problems in the Democratic Party. Because like you said, the right focuses more on her than the left does. The establishment left, the Democratic Party leadership, certainly in the House, Pelosi and all the others, they don't like her. They still do not care for her. The little civil war they had going on is kind of over now, especially, again, now that Trump is gone. They don't really have that to unite them anymore. They don't really care for her. She is still very much numerically a minority in the House. And for the time being, I don't think she's an institutional threat just yet. I think she is an indication of the future that will come of the left and future generations and more lawmakers like her, millennials and Gen Zers, who will eventually get elected, when the old people, the Pelosi's, inevitably die off or retire. And she's
not going to bring socialism to America.
She's not going to bring, I don't think so. No. But she's going to bring more like really obnoxious social media influencers who have no business being in Congress. So for the main topic, we have to address this. We mentioned it, of course, in previous episodes. But the latest on the Canadian truckers. Jacob, you refer to this as Truckistan, the fall of Truckistan. That, of course, since our last episode, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, decided to invoke something called the Emergency Act, which I guess is more or less just Canada's version of martial law. He basically is kind of suspending the rights of all those truckers who are protesting. He repeatedly has declared the protests to be illegal. He has called their views, quote, unacceptable, as we've talked about. He's called them a fringe minority. He's called them Nazis. He keeps accusing them. Still to this day, he's doubling down on the whole Nazi flag thing, even though there's no proof anywhere of a Nazi flag being waved at any of these rallies. So he now has the authority unilaterally to impose really steep fines and longer prison sentences on the truckers than prior to the invoking of this act. And of course, we've been seeing the videos out of Canada, especially in Ottawa. They've called in the cavalry. They've brought in the Mounties, as it were, the officers on horseback, to literally trample through the crowds to break them up. And this did result in several protesters being trampled underfoot, including a woman who some people initially reported that she died, but I think it turns out the latest I've heard is that she had survived her injuries. She is very injured, but she is still alive. But either way, even if she did survive, thank God she survived, because it looked Canada was on the verge of having its own Ashley Babbitt at that point. Because we were talking about this trucker thing to Canada is essentially to Canada what January 6th was to the United States. They are very much treating it. It was a peaceful protest for over a legitimate grievance that threatens the power structure and threatens the elite in that country. So now they have to crack down on it by any means necessary. Again, they've announced the Canadian government has quote unquote, has ordered banks to freeze the accounts of people who were found to have donated to the Give Send Go fundraiser for the truckers, which raised over $9 million. They're mass arresting people. They're beating people in the streets. They're trampling people. There's riot police there are seen stepping on the Canadian flag. These images are, I think, in the long term going to come back and haunt the Trudeau administration. But all that matters is the here and now, what is happening to them right now, and the blatant suppression of human rights. I would even call them, crimes against humanity at this point that are taking place in Canada. And there are several things that we need to take away from this. I think first off, of course, the question of can it happen here in the United States? I've had some discussions with friends about this. Could this happen in the United States where we actually do have a constitution that guarantees the freedom of speech, First Amendment, whereas Canada does not? Or is that already arguably happening in the U.S. with what's happening to, as I said, the January 6th protesters? FBI raids on their houses at 3 a.m, mass surveillance, shutting down bank accounts. We've seen all this here in America already, courtesy of these private companies working in tandem with the government. Jacob, what do you think? Do you think this is a precursor to the U.S., or is this following up what's already happening in the U.S.?
I don't think this is a precursor to what is going to happen in the United States for one simple reason. We don't have a vaccine mandate.
Right, because the Supreme Court struck down the most widespread of the most wide-reaching of the mandates, which was the OSHA mandate.
Yeah, and the issue with Canadian truckers is unlike here, like you can be an American trucker and never go to Canada and make a pretty handsome living. You don't have to go to Canada. We're that big of a country, that prosperous of a country. With Canadian truckers, they would do so much. We have so much commerce with Canada that it's very difficult to make a full-time living, I would assume, just because they're such a small country and never come to the United States. So it's a much bigger issue. That vaccine mandate is a much, much bigger issue with not being able to cross the border without the vaccine passport than it is for Americans. You can be an unvaxxed trucker and be just fine. So this is a reason why it's not that big of a deal in the United States. I was listening to a talk show on the issue a couple of days ago. This was a local radio station in Tennessee. And they were asking for call-ins, and a lot of truckers were calling in and giving their opinion on it. And the opinions were kind of mixed. It wasn't an overwhelming show of support for the Canadian truckers by American truckers. And one of the reasons is competition. A lot of American truckers don't like the fact that Canadian truckers are able to come to the United States because they look at them as being competitors. And one guy called in and he said that a lot of Canadian truckers, they come in, they're supposed to drop off their cargo and immediately return. A lot of them make deliveries here, whereas his attitude was, hey, maybe the vax passport will keep them from being allowed to come to America. So it's a very nuanced view with a lot of American truckers, and it's not as pressing with Americans because they're not faced with get vaccinated or go under financially.
Yeah, definitely. I think also something else that is important that needs to be talked about as a result of these Canadian protests is obviously it's clear. I know the left exaggerates police brutality all the time. They think, if a black person gets pulled over for running a red light, they think it's police brutality. But this is a case of actual police brutality. Again, watching that horrifying footage. I don't know if you've seen the videos, Jacob, but I've seen the videos of that woman literally getting trampled. And the cops keep moving right along. They keep moving right along as if nothing happened. People are rushing, trying to help the woman, and the riot police are beating them back and hitting them over the heads with batons. And people who are trying to film are getting their cameras knocked out of their hands. Just all kinds of stuff. Just acting like actual thugs, acting like a literal secret police. And it raises a very important question. I think this could be kind of the sub-main topic of this overall main topic is, does this ultimately mean that we are close to some sort of reconciliation on the right with supporting the police, a blanket, unapologetic support of the institution of police? Because something that has been big on the right ever since the birth of Black Lives Matter was Blue Lives Matter, the thin blue line, right? Back the blue, support the police, because, of course, all those years, the police were under sustained attack, institutional attack, I would argue, from the left on this whole, they're racist against black people, systemic racism, police brutality, blah, blah, blah. Again, none of which was real, but it was just another way that I think the left was seeking to deconstruct America by going after one of the most popular, most widely supported, most, I would argue, sacred institutions in our society, which is a police force that is to serve and protect the people and keep us safe. Because a lot of those are good, again, working class Americans who have families and traditional values for the most part, and they had to tear it down. And we saw that, of course, with, of course, the race riots in 2020, which amplified that even more. After the initial stuff in Ferguson and Baltimore and whatnot, it came to a head in 2020. And the right, understandably so, doubled down, on the blue line flags and whatnot, supporting the police. But then with the COVID stuff happening at the same time, who was it that had to ask the obvious question? Who is it who enforces the draconian lockdown laws? Who is it who will arrest someone for not wearing a mask? Who will arrest a father who is with his young daughter at a park, even though they're completely alone? They're not wearing masks, so they'll get arrested in public, and the little girl will be crying and screaming because her father's getting arrested in front of her. Who is dragging this guy off of a bus in Philadelphia? 5 officers dragging a guy off a bus in Philadelphia because he's not wearing a mask. All these things, you got to ask, who's enforcing it? Of course, it's the police. So, and you can make the argument, of course, they're like, oh, they're just following orders. They're answering to the bureaucrats, the mayors and the chiefs and whatnot. The chief who answers to the mayor, and of course, the mayor who has their own agenda. And that, of course, is why the National Guard was not allowed into certain cities during the 2020 riots, because, again, the mayors had the direct authority over that. So you can make that argument, although, of course, some would argue that, well, just following orders was a certain legal defense used by a defeated army in the 1940s that didn't really hold up too well at the trials at a place called Nuremberg. So and the point being, seeing what they are capable of when a police force like in Canada will so callously, stone-faced, no emotions whatsoever, will trample over a woman with their horses because they've been ordered to do so.
Well, did you see the photos that were taken from their group chat? Like the police in Ottawa, they were celebrating it. They were
really?
They were taking selfies,
celebrating the trampled woman.
Yeah, well, not specifically her, but just celebrating, cracking down the protests. Like they were taking selfies and everything. Yeah, we're about to go clean the streets, stuff like that. Like, be sure to leave some for us when we get off our lunch break. That type of stuff. Like
I did not see that.
They were reveling in the ability to finally put their training into usage by cleaning these thugs and this rabble. They were specifically calling them rabble in the text messages, that cleaning this rabble out of their streets because they view them as peasants who have no business, gracing the capital city with their dirty presence. That is the view of the people in Ottawa. So, and of course, there's this idea that somehow the police are going to be in solidarity with working class people. A lot of times, the reason why people go into the force, not everyone, but this is the reason why a lot of people go into the force, is because they weren't good enough to go into the military. And the reason why they wanted to go into the military to begin with is just because they weren't good enough to hold down a real job. So they go into the police because, hey, they like doing push-ups, they like lifting weights, and they would love to beat someone up if they get the opportunity. And I pointed this out to you earlier. I have to mention this one time. A lot of times the correct view of police should be as barroom bouncers. Like, you need barroom bouncers to keep order. Because people get drunk, they start fights, they want to destroy property. You need a bouncer to come in there and separate people, throw people out if they need to be thrown out. But nobody goes around with a bumper sticker saying, I support my local bouncer. That wouldn't make any sense. People would be like, huh? Well,
what?
I support my bouncer. So you support the bouncer when you go in and you buy a beer because you're paying that for that beer pays the bouncer's salary. I support the police when I pay taxes. My tax dollars pay the police's salary. I don't complain about that. I believe in having police. We need police, and my tax dollars pay for them. But to go around and, wave a blue – I understand police officers who have a thin blue line flag in their yard or on their private vehicle. That makes sense. They're police officers. Or maybe their spouse is a police officer. They have a son who's a police officer. That makes sense. But if you don't have a family member who's on the force – why are you wearing a thin blue line shirt? Why are you flying that flag? Why do you have that? That'd be kind of like me having the thin red line, for the firemen.
Firefighters.
I'm not a firefighter. I don't know anyone who's a firefighter. I don't have any reason to have that flag on my car or in my yard. And it's funny, I haven't seen many of those since the January 6th crackdown. I've seen less and less thin blue line flags. If you go way out in the boonies, you'll see someone who hasn't quite updated their firmware. They haven't quite kept up with the news for the past couple of years, and they're still living back in 2014. They're still thinking, I'm going to show my opposition to BLM by flying the thin blue line. But that's the thing. You got to understand, police officers are bureaucrats. They're bureaucrats with guns and batons with the authority to use them on civilians if civilians break the law. Their job is to enforce the laws and to keep the peace, and nothing more. Like, they're just doing a job. They're not heroes. Some of them are heroes. Every now and then they'll commit a heroic act. But being on the force does not make you a hero. And the right needs to understand that. Just because someone's wearing a uniform, that doesn't make them a hero.
I would argue, again, to push back a little bit, just because, again, I think there are lots of good people who are cops, because that's one of those things, you sign up to be a cop. You sign up to protect and serve your community ostensibly. So, yeah, it obviously is noble. But, again, the good people who sign up to be cops, those who want to protect their family and friends and traditional values, I would argue we lost a lot of those people in 2020. Of course, we saw all the headlines all over the place that when the riots started, and not just the riots, but the condemnation of police from leaders, from mayors, from governors, the institutions that said, oh, yes, we're going to do everything we can to, reform our police and fix the racism. You saw hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds, maybe even thousands of police officers, mostly in the big cities, but all across the country. They quit, they retired early, they transferred out, whatever. They left in mass. There was a mass exodus. Again, the first night of riots in Atlanta after the that one guy, I forget his name, the guy who got shot in front of the Wendy's or whatever, that first night of riots, there were no cops anywhere in the city because the mayor ultimately came out, Keisha Lance Bottoms at the time came right out and said, oh, yes, this was racism. The police were racist, even though all the body cam footage shows overwhelmingly they acted in their rights to do so in self-defense to shoot and kill the guy. So every single cop in the city said, all right, that's it. You really think we're racist? You don't want us? Okay, good luck. Have fun with your city for a night. And there were no cops on duty as the city burned. So the cops, they retired early. They, some of them went to private security, what have you. Those cops all left in the hundreds and even the thousands, even in the big cities, in Seattle, elsewhere. So what happened? You have all these vacancies that desperately need to be filled. So who do you think they're going to get to fill these vacancies suddenly? Obviously not the same kind of people who just left, because obviously if people want to step up to be a cop to protect America or to protect their hometown, you're not going to voluntarily sign up to be a cop in this environment where you're going to be called a racist just for wearing a uniform. So who you're going to get? You're going to get somebody who's probably a little more on in the style of like a DMV employee, someone who is just going to blindly follow orders and is not going to care as much about the criticism because they are going to go after the bad people. They're going to arrest, a guy who's wearing a mask, who's not wearing a mask. They're going to arrest a Trump supporter because he's a Trump supporter, things like that. So you're filling up these vacancies left behind by good cops with bad cops. Because obviously there are bad cops. Bad cops exist, obviously. And I think there are a lot more bad cops in America now as a result of that, the good being replaced with the bad. Over the course of 2020 and 2021, it continued over the course of last year as well, and it's been continuing this year and even into 2022. So I think supporting the institution, I think supporting individual police officers still makes sense, but it's the same as the military, right? Because the military, a great institution, we all love the idea of the military and love respecting the military. But what's happening in the military right now? It is being completely subverted and infiltrated from the top down. The Lloyd Austins, the Mark Millies, and all the others, the secretaries of whatnot, what have you, the Richard Levine, the tranny, who is at the Navy, I believe, who are now forcing critical race theory and transgenderism stuff on our military. And you can still make the argument, as has been made to me, that a lot of the boots on the ground, a lot of the rank and file don't buy into this for a second, and they still make, trans jokes and whatnot behind the scenes. They'll just never say it publicly. But at the end of the day, the military, like the police, is a chain of command. People are going to go along with it or they're going to get discharged. Look at the vaccine mandate stuff. The overwhelming majority of, requests for exemptions from the vaccines are rejected. And they say, nope, it's tough luck. You got to get this jab or else you're going to be discharged. And people are getting dishonorably discharged for refusing the vaccine mandates. The few who stand up and haven't already made successful legal challenges are just going to get fired on the spot. So that, too, is an institution that is worth questioning and criticizing at this point. You can certainly harken back to trying to restore it to what it was, but to continue acting like this is the police force of the 1990s, to continue acting like this is the military of the 1980s, it's just not the same anymore. And you've got to be prepared to acknowledge that and prepared to criticize it before you can begin to fix it. And that is all the time we have left for this episode of The Right Take. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, as always. So be sure to follow us at our website for all of our latest content, righttakepodcast.com. The full list of websites and podcast platforms where we are available, righttakepodcast.com/subscribe. And if you are feeling so generous, righttakepodcast.com/support. We'll talk to you next week, guys.